NPT productions like Tennessee Civil War 150 are made possible by the support of viewers like you. Click on the Donate button to make your contribution and get a copy of the show. Thank you.
Tennessee Civil War 150 is brought to you in part by Tennessee Department of Education, the University of Tennessee, Tennessee Civil War Sesquicentennial Commission, and Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area.
They say that the Negroes are very well contented in slavery. Suppose it were the fact the black man was contented to see his wife sold on the auction block or his daughter violated. I say that is the heaviest condemnation of the institution. That slavery should blot out a man's manhood so as to make him contented to accept this degradation. And such an institution ought to be swept from the face of the earth.
Sweet chariot.
For nearly 250 years, the New World that held the promise of freedom for oppressed white Europeans was a brutal prison for most Africans. The unfortunate souls who survived the abuse and filth aboard disease-ridden ships were condemned, along with their descendants, as human livestock, sold at auction to the highest bidder. Debate over whether or not to allow the westward expansion of slavery would lead to the bloodiest conflict in our nation's history. But the war that began as a means of preserving the Union held a much more personal promise for millions of Americans. Determined to claim basic human rights of freedom and education, and guided by an unwavering faith, former slaves turned soldiers would help defeat their oppressors. But the road to freedom would be a rocky one. Facing racial hatred and violence, African Americans would work tirelessly to rebuild families torn apart by slavery, to better themselves, and to claim their rightful place as American citizens.
He calls me, he calls.
Slavery was the great evil. You couldn't be a good man if you beat and whipped another man. Took everything that he labored for and killed him if he tried to run away, you know. No such thing as a good slave master.
There was a great deal of dehumanization. There was a failure to empathize. I think most slave owners did not think it was a terrible thing. You've got this economic interest that I think just superseded everything else.
People had to believe that the Negro was intellectually inferior. If not, it would have weighed heavily on their souls and consciousness. And the system was so perverse that slaves could be bought and sold, they could be bargained, they could be raffled off. These people are reduced to property.
The purchaser decided who he wanted. He might want a mother with an infant because that shows that she's fertile. Maybe he'll take that infant, but maybe he'll think that's too long an investment. If an infant was a burden, the trader might just get rid of that child. Some people lost not just one child, but many children, you know, and they would beg, let me keep even one of them. There was so much loss, so much devastation.
My old master was in some respects kinder than many other slaveholders, but he lacked in that humane feeling which should have kept him from buying and selling human beings. Possessing absolute power over the bodies and souls of their slaves, and grown rich from their unrequited toil, they became possessed by the demon of avarice and pride, and lost sight of the most vital of the Christly qualities.
Born a slave in Virginia, Lewis Hughes was 11 when he saw his mother for the last time. His sale to a Mississippi planter would lead him to Tennessee's cotton capital of Memphis.
Memphis was a river town, becoming a fairly bustling city.
No major industries at that point, other than, I guess you could say, its dependence on cotton. Cotton that would be sold in Memphis and then shipped to other parts of the country. Memphis is important to both the North and the South.
Slavery not only kept the economic engines in the South going, but those slave engines turned out that cotton, that was a part of the Industrial Revolution. Cotton truly was king. Cotton created thousands of jobs outside of the South. So this exploitation is sort of a conspiracy of silence among all.
By the early 19th century, abolitionists had succeeded in having slavery virtually eradicated in the northern United States. But the invention of Eli Whitney's cotton gin created the opposite effect in the South. The revolution in cotton production led to an explosion in the slave population from 700,000 in 1790 to nearly 4 million by 1860.
Tennessee had 275,000 slaves and 7,300 free Negroes. Those together were about 25 to 26% of the state's population. Slavery was heaviest in West Tennessee counties. There, about 70% of the slaves in the state lived.
In some counties along the fertile Mississippi Delta, more than half of the population lived in bondage. But not all slaves picked cotton, and not all blacks were slaves.
You had a freed black population. In Memphis, you had to be listed on the Free Negro Register. Many free black people chose to remain here because there was a level of certainty about how you would earn a living and who you could look to as your clients. And I think an even more important reason is that family is here. And many of these family members were enslaved.
Nashville had the largest free black population, but it also had the largest slave population, almost 4,000 persons. Here in 1860, who were free and enslaved. About 10% of the slaves were what we call urban slaves. They were in manufacturing, tobacco factories, iron factories, and throughout the Deep South, 86% of your skilled laborers were slaves and free Negroes. They were the carpenters, they were the stone cutters, they were the brick makers, they were the barbers. There was no such thing as a white barber in Nashville. In Middle Tennessee, 10,000 slaves worked in the iron mines. They were the ones who ran the smelters and the foundries that produced the iron products that were brought into the market in Nashville.
Regardless of occupation, the enslaved all had the same goal: freedom. Despite the risk of harsh punishment, even death if captured, the dream was too tempting for many.
We know about 50,000 slaves left the South on the Underground Railroad. There were so many escaping that is going to be one of the causes of the Civil War, because they say that the North is violating the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, where they are supposed to return this property, these people, and give them back to their particular owners, but they were not. And so they were escaping by the tens of thousands.
Lewis Hughes made the first of his 5 attempts to escape shortly after moving to his master's new home southeast of Memphis in 1850. With a $500 reward on his head, he was soon captured and punished for running away.
I could only stand and take lash after lash as long as he desired, the terrible rawhide cutting into my flesh at every stroke. This torture was common among the Southern planters. God only knows what I suffered under it all, and He alone gave me strength to endure.
One of the questions that people often ask about slavery is, how could black people have adopted Christianity, the religion of the oppressor? And what you see is that they took Christianity and they saw in it a religion of liberation that promised freedom. They saw the children of Israel. They saw themselves in that story. So Exodus became a really important story for them.
The relationship of religion and music is directly related to the slave experience. The sorrow songs, the spirituals, the rhythms of the field, the call and response tradition. Have you got good religion? Yes, Lord. Certainly, Lord.
I really got a feeling for the significance of religion and how religion worked in people's lives when I started working with the music that was part of separation. People would pour out of the fields as the people are marching away, and they had these songs that they sang, and I saw that mentioned by several people in slave narratives. There's a woman, she said she was walking through the trader's yard going to the auction block to be sold. Her husband had already been sold away. She had a child who was being left behind. And she overheard the trader's daughter singing a song, "How Firm a Foundation." It's very insistent that God will not forsake you. I will not, I will not. And she said, at that moment, she thought, well, I'm one of God's children. God is not going to forsake me. So they had music like that that I think helped them to keep going.
It may have been the only hope that these people had to hold on to. The ultimate reward, of course, is the hope of eternal salvation, eternal life, in freedom. If you have lived through slavery, which was hell, you hope for heaven.
Slaveholders feared educated black people. Illiteracy proved more effective than chains and shackles as a tool of enslavement. Teaching slaves to read or write was strictly forbidden.
Education, the ability to read, was the great desire. The great hope is that ability to read the Bible, to chart my own course, to be active in finding my own way to salvation.
Once you deny someone something, it tends to have the opposite effect. Blacks, even during the antebellum period, understand that reading and writing is a very powerful language. If you just think of it for practical purposes, it would pose a danger to the slave system. If you could read or write, you could potentially write a bill of sale. You could forge a pass. Savvy black children, often the playmates of their white owners' children, would dare each other and say, "Can you spell my name?" And of course, the white child, "Yes, I can spell your name." "Well, spell it." And so then he spells it, and the black child is like, "Okay, that's how you spell it." He says, "Well, can you write it?" And of course, the white child says, "Of course I can write it," and he writes it. And so in these moments, even black children are finding avenues to really access education.
They really tied literacy to liberation, whether spiritual liberation or physical freedom.
Black people knew exactly what the war should be about, and that was a war to end slavery. How could you fight this war if you weren't going to do something about this issue of slavery?
For the Confederate state of Tennessee, the Civil War started poorly and got worse. The fall of Forts Henry and Donelson in February 1862 opened up the state for invasion. Nashville became the first state capital to be reclaimed by Union forces, with Memphis following in June. Advancing Northern armies, viewed as hated intruders by the rebels, were answered prayers to the enslaved. It was the beginning of the end of the great evil.
The choice of a slave to leave his or her plantation to venture to a Union Army camp to seek refuge was a courageous one, but in many ways a naive one. Just to get to a Union camp was a great success. You had to avoid your master. And then you'd also have to avoid slave patrols that were out looking for escaped slaves, regardless of who owned them. Added to that is the reality that the Union Army didn't really want freedmen.
During the war, slavery is ending, it's unraveling, and it's unraveling haphazardly. Lots of people are freeing themselves by escaping. But nobody had planned for this. Right? Abe Lincoln went in saying this is a white man's war and this is not about slavery. He changes over time, but nobody had come up with a strategic plan for how slavery would end and what would become of the people.
More and more African Americans, more and more slaves are defining the war as a war to end slavery by just simply picking up and leaving the plantations. Then they're forced into a new position of, what do we do now? How do you deal with this huge population of people who are saying to the nation, we're not going to be slaves?
The Army is sending many of them back from Nashville, from Memphis, from Clarksville, because they can't be housed, they cannot be fed, they cannot be provided with medicine. It was a bad situation for both sides, the slave and for the Union Army.
In the summer of 1861, Congress passed legislation stating that a Confederate's property, including slaves, could be confiscated by Union forces. The law was half-heartedly enforced. Many Northern commanders preferred the easier alternative of returning slaves to their masters. That would change the following summer when the passage of a second Confiscation Act made it a crime to deny refuge to runaway slaves. The War of Emancipation had begun.
The Confiscation Act of 1862 is really the one that unleashes the flood of slaves who began to come out of the countryside. All you got to do is to come into a Union Army camp and say, yeah, my master is a damn rebel and he's been fighting against the United States. And they couldn't send him back. They had learned a particular passage down to a T. The Southerners put themselves in a bad position because they're calling these people property. You could confiscate their property. And so it unleashes a flood of slaves. So you have large contraband camps that are going to develop. The slaves are going to be flooding into those areas.
We show our sympathy with slavery by emancipating slaves where we cannot reach them and holding them in bondage where we can set them free.
The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 did not apply to Tennessee or any other areas under Union control. President Lincoln did not want to alienate loyal slave states by taking their property. What the proclamation did do was give freedmen a chance to fight for the army that helped liberate them.
The Union Army has a great advantage because it's going to be able to get 200,000 black men into military service. It's going to be able to get another 200,000 or so laborers, men and women, that would do all kinds of work for the Union Army.
The desire that drove black soldiers was a lot deeper, I think, than desire to save the Union. They were more personal and more direct. Versus many other populations that have come to this country, we're the only ones that came in chains. We wanted to show the world and show ourselves that we were the equal, or even in some cases superior, of our adversaries and of our masters. So they went to great lengths to prove themselves. Their idea was to prove that, yes, we deserve that ballot box, and that jury box, and those things that make us citizens. The Emancipation Proclamation itself opened that door. It gave us the right to do that. It gave us the right to die for what we believed to.
Despite initial skepticism about black soldiers, the United States colored troops distinguished themselves in battle time and time again. Nearly 24,000 freedmen served in the Union Army in Tennessee, culminating in the Battle of Nashville in December 1864. On both days of the battle, the USCT charged the enemy's right flank. Intended as a diversionary maneuver, the ferocity of the black troops' advance made an impact on the rebel forces.
The assault was so vigorous and so direct that the Confederate Army felt that must be where the main attack is coming from, because these people are coming at us very strongly and very hard and taking horrendous casualties.
They lose 575 men at Peach Orchard Hill, and they just simply waited till they came up to the top of that hill, and then they let the cannon loose on them. There were hundreds of black soldiers that died.
The descriptions also indicate that the bodies were so thick you could just walk up and down that hill and never touch the ground. It must have been a horrible sight, just horrible.
But they fought well, they suffered well, but it was one of the big battles that got rid of that rumor that blacks would not make good soldiers. After Nashville, the Confederacy is finished.
A black soldier who came upon the white prisoners of war. One particular person was actually the master of the plantation where he had previously served. And the master looked up and said, "What do you think about this?" And the soldier said, "Well, massa, the way I sees it, bottom rail on top now."
Steal away to Jesus.
In the aftermath of the Civil War, freed people are very certain of what freedom is supposed to mean to them. One of the first things that many of them do is to enter into some kind of legal marriage. For example, in the contraband camps, they'd have these mass marriage ceremonies where you'd have like 20, 30 black couples who would just stand up and they would be married all at the same time. To many black people, freedom meant getting your family back together. There are all kinds of records and stories of that in newspapers in the aftermath of the Civil War. Freedom could mean physical mobility. That's freedom when you can just kind of walk away from that plantation. But then the complication is that you may not be allowed to take your children with you. Your owner might say, "No, you're free, but these children stay here."
They said, "We have raised these children, they are ours." And so the parents had to basically steal their own children. Many people talked about stealing themselves during slavery, because if you belonged to somebody and you escaped, you had stolen yourself in essence. And so after the war, they're having to steal their children. And they would come up with these plots where a mother would go to the fence and people she had known would bring her children in the night to the fence, and she would take the children. And you see this happening over and over and over. They had spent generations thinking about freedom and seeing freedom. They knew what freedom looked like. They knew what white people had, and they knew what they didn't have. So they kept expanding their notion of freedom, because they realized that just being called free wasn't enough, that it has to come with rights, it has to come with opportunities. And they have to be able to have rights and be able to defend those rights and have somebody enforce those rights.
The Civil War freed nearly 4 million African Americans and destroyed much of the South. Former slaves, and many whites, were now homeless and facing starvation. Congress created a new bureau in the War Department to oversee the daunting task of establishing a new social order in the postbellum South.
The Bureau of Freedmen, Refugees, and Abandoned Lands. It's created to try to figure out, what do you do with the freedmen? How do you introduce this free labor system into the South, and how's it going to work?
The plan was just for 1 year to provide the kind of immediate need of food, housing, shelter, and later education.
I needed education, and it was one of the bitterest remembrances of my servitude that I had been cheated out of this right, this blessing. I entered the night school for freedmen and faithfully attended its sessions.
Some of these schools are built by blacks themselves, black churches.
The church was hand in hand with education. Sunday schools were quite important. They become the great lesson plans.
Some of the schools are actually started by missionary societies, and others are started by the Freedmen's Bureau.
It was vastly different after the war, vastly different, that a black kid could go to school and a black person would be at the front of the room saying, "I'm a teacher." unheard of. And it was so outrageous that, of course, lots of violence was unleashed against black schools and black teachers.
17-year-old Julia Hayden had gone out to a country school, which many of the students at black colleges did at this time. She finds herself there just 3 days before there's a knock at the door in the middle of the night. And she is shot dead for no reason other than her determination to be a country school teacher.
When Fisk School opened its doors with money from the American Missionary Association and the Freedmen's Bureau, that money would only last for 4 years because the Freedmen's Act was not refunded. It had been a free school, and now tuition would be required, and those people had no tuition. George White, who was the school's treasurer, heard the Fisk students in the evenings.
They were singing songs that we now know as spirituals. They are the product of the sorrows of the black slave experience. And he marvels at the beauty of these songs.
And George White proposes a student chorus.
They set out on a journey that would take them to Europe, where they are able to raise enough money not only to save Fisk, they also were able to support the American Missionary Association for the years that they toured.
They are poised, they are disciplined, they present an image that's undoubtedly one of a refined human, an intellectual equal to any group of people on earth. Their image and their presentation did much to elevate the status of the African American. They presented their music. They presented it to the world. Queen Victoria, who at that particular time held dominion over most of Africa, would sit and listen to a group of former slaves. It began a tradition in the United States of people coming together in churches, enjoying these spirituals, and they become a part of the American panorama.
Slavery destroyed many black families, but slavery did not destroy the black family. Coming out of slavery, I do not see people who had stopped caring. 4 decades later, people were still looking for family members.
After 30 years as a slave, Lewis B. Hughes moved to Wisconsin, became a nurse, and raised a family. But he never forgot the loved ones torn from him so many years before. After enduring so much sadness, fate finally smiled on Lewis as he discovered his long-lost brother William living in Ohio.
When we met, neither of us spoke for some moments. Speech is not for such occasions, but silence and the rush of thoughts. When the first flash of feeling had passed, I spoke, calling him by name, and he addressed me as brother. He told me that he had never heard anything of our mother or brother. He went back to the old home in Virginia, but could get no trace of her. As we related the hardships and sorrows which we endured, and at last the coming of brighter days, we were sad, then happy. As I looked into the faces of his wife and children, I seemed to have entered a new and broader life. After many promises of relations thus renewed, we parted, to take up again the burdens of life, but with new inspiration and deeper feeling.